Now, the Uri terror attack has cast a shadow also on the SAARC summit scheduled for November in Pakistan. The global community is standing firm with India in condemning the act against terror. The question is, will India now go ahead and boycott the SAARC meet this year to send a tough message to Islamabad?
For Nawaz Sharif and the Pakistan government, the script is almost predictable. Almost every year, ahead of the United Nations General Assembly, the Pakistani Prime Minister ups the ante on Kashmir. This year, India's angry response to the terror attack in Uri is likely to be used by the Pakistanis to once again try and internationalize Kashmir. From the moment Sharif landed in New York, the heat has been turned on him by several governments, most notably US Secretary of State John Kerry. Sharif's address is also likely to set the stage for External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj's intervention later this week at the UNGA. While Sushma seeks to garner global support against terror havens in Pakistan, the Modi government faces another tough choice. Should the Prime Minister boycott the SAARC summit in November, scheduled to be held in Islamabad? Already Afghanistan and Bangladesh have indicated that they would like a firm message to Islamabad.
My suggestion would be that we convene in the outset a regional conference by countries who are suffering from this, and then take this position to the global stage, particularly under the leadership of the United Nations. We have to convene a global conference against terrorism, especially against those who sponsor terrorism.
Will India follow suit is the big question. With elections in key states like Uttar Pradesh early next year, the Prime Minister may not want to take a risk. In December last year, he travelled to Lahore to greet Sharif on his birthday. Less than a month later, the army camp in Pathankot was attacked. Bureau Report, India Today.
So what really are India's diplomatic options post-Uri? Who better to tell us that than someone who was a career diplomat, is now a member of Parliament, of course, and also chairperson of the Parliament Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs. Shashi Tharoor, pleasure to have you in the studios. The big question, Mr. Tharoor, is what are India's realistic options post-Uri, given the fact that you yourself were with the United Nations for years? Can we really isolate Pakistan today at the UNGA?
Look, I think what we're going to try and do at the UN is to point fingers, but unfortunately there's so much of tutu meme at the United Nations at the best of times that governments will be bound to take it with a pinch of salt. I get the sense that on this, the preponderance of governmental opinion would be in our favor. Everyone knows that Pakistan has been resorting to this sponsorship of militancy and terrorism across the border in our country for some time. I don't think there's much sympathy for the Pakistanis on this. So whatever Sushma ji says in her speech, for example, is bound to some degree to have a positive resonance. You can be sure that Nawaz's speech will be also pointing fingers at us on Kashmir. And because each side is blaming the other, there's a certain amount of discounting that takes place. But beyond that, there are no negotiations on these issues. If anything, our approach at the United Nations has been to keep Kashmir out of the United Nations. So we are in a paradoxical position. We don't want Kashmir discussed by the United Nations, but we want Pakistan to be condemned for terrorism. And unfortunately, the Pakistanis naturally obviate the latter by linking it to the former.
That's an important point you make, the worry of Pakistan internationalizing Kashmir, particularly if we push them too hard. But on the other hand, two key countries, the US and China, have in the past resisted, some would believe, India's attempts to ensure that Pakistan is seen and is blamed for being a terrorist haven.
Well, no, the US actually has gone along with us in the Sanctions Committee when it's come to naming and shaming people like Hafiz Saeed, his whole outfit, the JUD and others.
But the Pakistani state, the Pakistani
state, you see, the US has its own independent process for listing state sponsors of terrorism, and they've not been willing to consider Pakistan in that category because they still have this vain hope that Pakistan is reformable. Pakistan is an important ally for them as long as they have troops in Afghanistan. They need Pakistan to be on their side, indispensable for logistics and as a support base and so on. And therefore they try and dance on this tightrope. We've seen this now for 30 years. It's not a new phenomenon with the US, but at least they've not been at all negative as far as it comes to our interests, whereas the Chinese, as you know, to our surprise, have actually put a hold in the Sanctions Committee on specific Pakistani individuals.
Including Masood Azhar, whose organization, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, is believed to be responsible for Uri. Given that, what do you believe is our realistic diplomatic options? There are some who are saying that India should, in a sense, now ensure that Pakistan is at least boycotted in the neighborhood, that you have a SAARC summit minus Pakistan, or some kind of a message by boycotting SAARC in Islamabad in November. Do you agree with that?
I think that needs a lot of very careful reflection, because we have to ask ourselves what we have been hoping to gain out of SAARC as an institution and whether we want to jeopardize it over one particular incident. You know, as far as isolating Pakistan is concerned, nothing could have been worse than 26/11. 166 people died, innocents, civilians, various nationalities had victims, and therefore it was the classic example of a situation where we could have and did succeed in isolating Pakistan. Here the numbers are much lower. It's 18 and they're all soldiers, and that immediately reduces the level of global sympathy. We're not going to be able to do, as a result of Uri, even as much as we were able to do after 26/11. So let us understand things in perspective from the point of view of other countries, each of which have their own issues on terrorism, many of which,
Afghanistan, Bangladesh share similar concerns that terrorism emanating out of Pakistan has, in a sense, targeted these countries as well. Why can't India create a bloc that puts pressure on the Pakistani state, in a sense, to say that unless you do A, B, C, we will not come to Islamabad?
Well, look, we can certainly attempt that. I certainly am not in favor of ruling out any options, including calibrating that pressure upwards to the extent that actually each country has its own dynamic with Pakistan. They may also come under the Afghans have a number of bilateral dependencies on Pakistan because they're next door neighbors, which they cannot simply write off. So we have to see how far we can push these countries into participating in such a strategy. But the larger thing we have to ask ourselves is, can pressure, diplomatic or otherwise, solve something as fundamental as the dominance of the Pakistani military in that country's establishment? We're dealing not with an episodic set of reactions, Rajdeep. We have to understand it's in the nature of the Pakistani state. I've often said that, you know, in India, the state has an army, in Pakistan, the army has a state. But the entire point about this is that the army controls the Pakistani state, either directly by ruling it for half its life, or indirectly behind the scenes, restraining the civilians and how far they can go. And it's in the army's interest to keep up a certain level of hostility with India, because this is what justifies their disproportionate share of Pakistani national resources. Now, this is not going to change easily. The military in Pakistan is fundamental to our understanding of Pakistan. Diplomatically shaming the civilian government only works up to a point.
Are you then effectively saying, Mr. Tharoor, that the diplomatic option is severely limited? That given the nature of the Pakistani state, whatever we do, the Pakistani army will continue, in a sense, to provoke us, continue to support terror groups operating out of Pakistan? Is that your unfortunate conclusion?
Unfortunately, it is, and it's a conclusion I've come to reluctantly over a period of time, because we've now tried everything else. I mean, don't forget that the NDA government had a major peace initiative. You've got the bus journey followed by Kargil. You've had the attack on Parliament followed by further peace talks in Agra. You've had the Great Thaw of 2003-4 followed again by hostility. Then you have the Mumbai attacks. Couple of years of isolation, back to square one.
But we can't be, we can't be seen to be helpless. We can't be seen to allow the status quo to continue in this manner, Mr. Tharoor.
Correct. So we are not helpless. but we have to have both a long-term strategy and a short-term set of tactical responses. In terms of long-term strategy, to my mind, it's very clear that we have to draw a very clear distinction between creating people-to-people contacts, strengthening them, and enlarging the constituency within Pakistan for normal relations with India, thereby narrowing the options for the military in the long term. And in the short term, we have to be reactive to the kinds of things we have seen with the Pathankot, Uri, and so on, where we will take the appropriate diplomatic, economic, and other measures that will show them that such actions cannot go unpunished.
Give me an example of what you would do. If you were in the place of the NDA government, if you were in Narendra Modi's hot seat, what would you really do?
Well, I think the first thing that he should do are things that neither he nor you nor I can talk about on television. I think it's very, very important that we develop the kind of serious capacity that Pakistan clearly enjoys deploying on our side. And I don't mean terrorism, that's not our way. I mean calibrated, punitive actions of which the Indian state ought to be capable, but which the Indian state cannot possibly talk about. That's one option that must always be there.
That's covert operations. That's covert operations, because you're saying this at a time when the Prime Minister raised Baluchistan on Independence Day. There's a possibility of the Baluch leader, Mr. Bukti, being given asylum in this country. Do you believe that's a bit of adventurism that we are trying, or do you believe that's perfectly acceptable?
Perfectly acceptable, because as you know, we gave asylum to the Dalai Lama when he was fleeing another neighboring state. We've given asylum to Bangladeshis at different times who have fled military rule in that country. We can certainly do the same when it comes to Pakistanis fleeing Pakistani persecution.
So you're saying raise the costs. You're saying raise the costs for Pakistan's continued cross-border terrorism. Find ways in which we can reply without, of course, making it necessarily overt. Because the worry is, by speaking so much about Baluchistan, we are in a sense compromising our position to do something in Baluchistan.
Exactly, and that applies across the board, not only in Baluchistan.
Sure.
Because there are people who are rather evident targets in Pakistan for those in India who are deeply angered and deeply frustrated by this conduct, who have somehow not been targeted by India or by, shall we say, forces accountable to India but not officially and overtly associated with us. These are things we can't talk about, but it is necessary for any serious state to have that capacity. In addition, diplomatic action, yes, but while fully recognizing the limitations, as you put it, of how far diplomatic action can be effective. And then finally, thinking of other imaginative methods. You mentioned using Pakistan's interest in a successful SAARC summit against them. Certainly there are economic options also available. And of course, when it comes to improving our own preparedness, our own planning to ensure that we don't have a situation where militants can slip into our bases. That's happened twice this year. We ought to be frankly ashamed of our level of preparedness and security.
I'm sorry if I'm being direct here, but there are those who say that we should be like Israel. We should be able to strike at will. We should be able to eliminate or take out a Hafiz Saeed or a Masood Azhar or a Dawood Ibrahim. I know you can't say it on television, but would you support such actions that are taken in the interest of, say, the right of hot pursuit, targeting terrorist camps? Do you believe these are legitimate options in the nuclear age?
Terrorist camps, to be very honest, I'm not sure it's worth the candle, because it means our Air Force, for example, having to bomb across the border, which is a casus belli and can invite retaliation from their side. And basically these training camps are a bunch of tents and a few target barracks, which they can easily rebuild again in a few weeks. I'm not sure that other than venting our frustration, we accomplish very much by that. But certainly the first scenario that you mentioned, which we can't talk about, I would simply commend the filmmakers who made the movie Phantom. I think every Indian, and certainly many in South Block, ought to watch it.
No, that's interesting you're saying that, because often the worry has been that either we don't have the stomach or the political will for it, or the bipartisan support. I mean, one of the questions that has been raised in the past is, when the UPA was in power, was the NDA or was Mr. Modi fully supportive of the UPA's actions on Pakistan policy? And he was not. The other way to look at it is the time has come for bipartisanship. So as the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee, would you support it or not?
Radeep, I have consistently been a bipartisan voice in foreign policy. I've always said that there is no such thing as a Congress foreign policy or a BJP foreign policy. There is only Indian foreign policy. Our national interests are larger than any one party. I deplore some of the conduct of the BJP when they were in opposition. I don't want my party to descend to that level. I think the country comes before any of our political interests, but at the same time, it's also necessary for the government to reach out to the opposition, take it into confidence, consult its leadership as it takes major steps, rather than doing things unilaterally and then demanding understanding.
The interesting thing is you're saying this a day after Rahul Gandhi called for accountability from the government for security lapses, questioned the flip-flops that Mr. Modi has done on his Pakistan policy. So I'm uncertain what is the Congress's stand. Is it what you're saying today, that bipartisanship above all else in foreign policy, or is it what Rahul Gandhi says, hold the government accountable?
As I explained to you, Rajdeep, these are, by the way, every single thing that Rahul Gandhi said, I stand behind. I've said the very same things myself in writing and on television. Pakistan policy has been incoherent. There has been a great deal of inconsistency in the government's approach. The government has not taken the nation into confidence. I'm saying if the government does its own part, takes the nation and the opposition into confidence, works out a joint approach, bipartisanship will definitely follow and must follow, because the country comes first when fundamental national interests are involved. But it takes two hands to clap, and it will take two hands for a bipartisan policy.
So therefore, in conclusion, like Narasimha Rao once invited Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 1994 to take India's case against Pakistan to the world, maybe the time has come for Sushma Swaraj to invite you, given your experience in the United Nations, given the fact that you are the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Shashi Tharoor and Sushma Swaraj in a joint delegation to world capitals to push the world against Pakistan.
Whenever I go abroad, I speak as an Indian anyway, Rajdeep. I continue to do so, whether the government invites me or not. India is still what I think I'm in politics for.
Interesting, Shashi Tharoor, and interesting that you've suggested in this program somewhere that a phantom-like operation against Pakistan may well be called for, even though you've not spelled out exactly what that operation should be, as none of us can, given the security implications. Thank you very much, Mr. Tharoor, for joining us. That was Shashi Tharoor, Chairperson of the Standing Committee on External Affairs. So what really are India's realistic options? We heard it from Shashi Tharoor there. Let me try and tell you what are the clear options. One, of course, the obvious one, which is expose Pakistan at the United Nations General Assembly. But as Mr. Tharoor pointed out, that's been attempted before, not exactly succeeded. Pakistan will then try and internationalize Kashmir once again. Option number two is a little bit more possible or feasible. Boycott the SAARC summit in Islamabad that's due in early November. It'll send a strong signal possibly to Pakistan, and not just India, get other countries like Afghanistan and Bangladesh to join the boycott. Option number three, and this is, remember, there is a major BRICS summit that's coming up where India along with Brazil, Russia, China will be on one platform, and that again, and South Africa, could be an opportunity for India in Panjim, where that summit is to be held, to keep the heat on Pakistan. There is also the other option of a Southeast Asian diplomatic push. Remember, the Modi government has often spoken of its Look East policy. Can it get support from regions and countries outside South Asia as well?